When you think about the most terrifying weapon of the early Second World War, chances are you picture the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. That piercing scream as it dropped from the sky, the vertical dive, the precision bombing that seemed almost surgical. The Nazis used it as a terror weapon during the Blitzkrieg, and for a brief moment in history, it was absolutely unstoppable. But here is what most people do not know. By 1943, 8 out of every 10 men who climbed into that cockpit were dead, 82% casualties. The weapon that terrorized Europe became a flying coffin for the men who flew it. And because this story involves some genuinely disturbing details about what happened to these aircrews when they got shot down, the brutal reality of what it was like to fly a Stuka once the tide turned against Germany, and the desperate final missions that were essentially suicide runs, we are giving you a chance here to reconsider watching this video. Take this as a genuine warning before we go any further. So, if you are still here, let us start with why this aircraft went from being Germany's most feared weapon to a death sentence for its own pilots. The Stuka was born in the mid-1930s, when the Luftwaffe was still being rebuilt in secret. Germany needed a precision ground attack aircraft, something that could work closely with advancing tank columns and infantry. You see, traditional level bombers were not accurate enough. You could drop bombs from 10,000 feet, sure, but hitting a specific bridge or a single bunker, that was nearly impossible with the technology of the time. The answer was dive bombing. Instead of flying level and hoping your bombs landed somewhere near the target, you would dive almost vertically, release at the last possible moment, and pull out. The physics were brutal but simple. The steeper the dive, the more accurate the bomb. And the Junkers Ju-87, which entered service in 1937, was purpose-built for this kind of attack. It had those distinctive inverted gull wings, fixed landing gear with aerodynamic fairings, and that infamous Jericho trumpet siren. Now just pause for a moment and think about that siren. It was not there by accident. The Germans deliberately fitted wind-driven sirens to the landing gear, so when the Stuka dove, it produced that ear-splitting scream. It sounded like a banshee, like the sky itself was screaming. Pure psychological warfare. The sound alone could break the morale of troops on the ground before a single bomb fell. It is really fascinating how much thought went into terrorizing the enemy, not just killing them. And here is the cruel irony we will come back to. The weapon designed to spread terror would eventually terrorize its own crews just as much. The Stuka proved itself during the Spanish Civil War. Then came Poland in September 1939. The Stuka was absolutely devastating. Polish forces had almost no effective anti-aircraft defenses and limited fighter cover. German Stukas operated with near impunity, destroying bridges, supply depots, and troop columns with pinpoint accuracy. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical destruction. Polish soldiers would hear that scream and panic, sometimes abandoning positions before bombs even fell. France and the Low Countries in 1940 saw the same story repeated. The Stuka became the symbol of Blitzkrieg, the flying artillery that cleared the path for German tanks. Let me tell you about one pilot from those early days. We will call him Oberleutnant Heinrich Weiss. He flew Stukas during the invasion of France in May 1940. He was 23 years old, wrote letters home about how unstoppable they felt, how French troops would scatter at the sound of the dive. He completed 47 successful missions without a scratch. The Luftwaffe promoted him, called him a hero. 4 months later, on August 18, 1940, during a raid against Royal Air Force airfields in southern England, a Spitfires intercepted his formation. Weiss's Stuka took cannon fire from below. The round shredded his fuel tanks and killed his rear gunner instantly. Weiss tried to bail out as the aircraft caught fire, but his parachute snagged on the tail assembly. He was still attached to the burning aircraft when it hit the ground near Pulborough. Believe me, that transformation from unstoppable to dead in 4 months was not unusual. It was the pattern, because the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 changed everything. The Stuka faced modern fighters, the Spitfire and Hurricane, flown by pilots defending their own homeland with proper radar early warning systems, and the results were catastrophic. On that single day, August 18th, the Luftwaffe lost 16 Stukas. That does not sound like much until you realize these attacks involve formations of maybe 30 to 40 aircraft total. Losing 16 in one day was a disaster. And here is the thing. The problem was not bad luck or poor tactics. The problem was the Stuka itself. It was slow. Maximum speed was only about 240 miles per hour. Compare that to a Spitfire doing 360. The fixed landing gear created drag, which meant you could not outrun anything, which meant you died. The lack of defensive armament, just one machine gun for the rear gunner, meant you could barely fight back, which meant you died. And most importantly, the Stuka had almost no armor protection for the crew, which meant a single burst could kill both men instantly, which it often did. Now, let me tell you what it was actually like for a Stuka crew when a fighter got on their tail. The rear gunner would see the fighter coming, maybe 500 yards back, closing fast. He would start firing his single machine gun, which had almost no chance of bringing down a modern fighter. The pilot would hear his gunner screaming through the intercom and try to maneuver, but the Stuka was not built for dogfighting. It was heavy, slow, and designed to dive in a straight line, not twist and turn. British pilots would attack from below and behind, where the rear gunner could not depress his gun low enough to shoot. A few bursts from 8 Browning machine guns would shred the Stuka's unarmored fuel tanks, ignite the engine, or kill the crew outright. If the pilot survived the initial attack, he had maybe seconds to decide whether to bail out or try to crash land. And here is where it gets even worse. Bailing out of a Stuka was incredibly difficult. The fixed landing gear, the dive brakes, the canopy design, all of it made escape nearly impossible at low altitude. Many pilots who tried to jump hit the tail on the way out and were knocked unconscious or killed instantly. The saddest part was that many rear gunners never even got the chance to try. Their position was more exposed and they usually died when the first rounds hit. By the end of August 1940, the Luftwaffe pulled Stukas out of the battle entirely. It was the first time the weapon that had terrorized Europe was forced to retreat. Let that sink in. But the Eastern Front, which opened in June 1941, gave the Stuka a second life, at least for a while. Soviet air defenses in the early months were weak and disorganized. German Stuka pilots racked up enormous kills against Soviet tanks and artillery. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most famous Stuka pilot, personally destroyed over 500 Soviet tanks. He became a legend, and he is one of the extremely rare examples of a Stuka pilot who survived the entire war. But what often gets left out of these hero stories is the cost. For every Rudel who survived, there were dozens of crews who did not. And as the Soviet Air Force rebuilt itself with modern fighters, and as Soviet anti-aircraft defenses improved dramatically, flying a Stuka became just as deadly on the Eastern Front as it had been over Britain. Soviet flak was brutal. The Red Army deployed thousands of anti-aircraft guns. Stukas flew low and slow, which made them perfect targets. A single hit to the engine or fuel tank meant the crew was dead. There was no time to bail out at low altitude, and crash landing in enemy territory was not much better. Now, before we move on to just how bad it got, let us talk about what it was like inside a Stuka during an actual combat mission. The crew consisted of 2 men, a pilot in the front and a radio operator/rear gunner in the back. The cockpit was cramped, noisy, and freezing cold at altitude. Before a dive bombing attack, the pilot would climb to around 15,000 feet, position the aircraft over the target, and then roll inverted to begin the dive. The Stuka dove at an angle between 60 and 90 degrees, almost straight down. The pilot would extend the dive brakes to keep the speed under control. The G-forces during the dive were intense. Blood would drain from the pilot's head toward his feet. Vision would narrow to a tunnel. Some pilots blacked out entirely. At around 1,500 feet, the pilot would release the bombs and pull back hard on the stick. The rear gunner had the worst job of all. He sat backward, watching for enemy fighters. And during the dive, he experienced the same crushing G-forces but without any control over what was happening. If a fighter attacked during the dive, there was nothing he could do except try to shoot back and hope the pilot could pull out in time. Can you imagine that? Sitting backward in a cramped metal tube, watching the ground rush up at 350 miles per hour, completely dependent on someone else not to kill you both. It sounds absolutely terrifying, and it surely was. By 1942, the Stuka's vulnerability was undeniable. German losses mounted steadily. Stuka units began suffering 20, 30, even 40% casualties during major operations. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training, sometimes less than 100 hours of flight time total. These new crews often died on their first or second mission. Let that sink in. You would get assigned to a Stuka unit, fly 1 or 2 combat missions, and then you were dead. Let me tell you about a pilot named Feldwebel Karl Braun. He was 19 years old when he arrived at his Stuka unit on the Eastern Front in July 1943. He had 87 hours of total flight time. The squadron he joined had lost 6 crews in the previous 2 weeks. Braun's first mission was an attack on Soviet tanks near Kursk. He made it through, barely. His aircraft came back with 14 bullet holes. His second mission, 3 days later, was against Soviet artillery. Yak-9 fighters intercepted his formation on the way back. Braun's Stuka was hit in the engine and caught fire. He and his gunner crashed 6 miles behind Soviet lines. Neither body was ever recovered. Total combat time, 6 days. The experienced crews who survived knew exactly how dangerous it had become. They flew anyway because they had no choice. But the psychological toll was enormous. Stuka pilots had some of the highest rates of combat stress and mental breakdown in the entire Luftwaffe. You can imagine what it does to a man, watching half his squadron get shot down over the course of a few weeks, knowing that statistically, his turn is coming. The numbers tell the story better than words ever could. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany produced approximately 6,000 Stukas. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had lost so many that production was scaled back, and eventually stopped entirely in September 1944. Casualty rates for Stuka crews reached 82% by 1943. If you were assigned to a Stuka unit in 1943, you had less than a 1 in 5 chance of surviving the war. Even U-boat crews, who faced horrific losses of around 75%, did not quite reach 82%. The Stuka became one of the most dangerous aircraft to fly in the entire German military. And here is the thing that makes it even worse. Many Stuka crews who got shot down did not die quickly. If you were hit and your aircraft caught fire, you had maybe 10 or 15 seconds before the whole thing exploded. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing, so one tracer round would turn the plane into a fireball. Those who survived the crash often died from their injuries, or they were captured by enemy forces who, especially on the Eastern Front, were not particularly interested in taking prisoners from air crews who had just been bombing their positions. Now, we really have to be careful with descriptions here, but Soviet forces showed little mercy to captured German air crews. There are documented cases of executions on the spot. Others were handed over to local civilians who had just been bombed. If we described it here in detail, the video would surely be taken down from YouTube, but you get the idea. The saddest part was that many Stuka crews knew this was coming. They understood the statistics. They saw their friends die mission after mission. But they kept flying because the alternative was a court-martial for cowardice, which in Nazi Germany meant a firing squad. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Luftwaffe tried to withdraw Stukas from the most dangerous missions. But the reality was that by this point, there were no safe areas anymore. Allied and Soviet air superiority was nearly complete. The Stuka's last major operations came during the desperate defense of Germany itself in 1945, where commanders threw them against Soviet tank armies advancing toward Berlin. These missions were essentially suicide runs. One pilot, Lieutenant Franz Richter, flew his final mission on April 25, 1945, against Soviet tanks near Berlin. He was 21 years old. His aircraft was one of 7 Stukas that took off that morning. 3 were shot down by flak before reaching the target. 2 more were destroyed by fighters on the way back. Richter made it back, but his Stuka was so badly damaged it was written off. The next day, Soviet tanks overran the airfield. Richter survived the war, one of the lucky 18%. He never flew again. The legacy of the Stuka is complicated and dark. On one hand, it was a genuinely revolutionary aircraft when it first appeared. Every modern ground attack aircraft, from the A-10 Warthog to the Su-25 Frogfoot, owes something to the lessons learned from the Stuka. But on the other hand, the Stuka represents one of the clearest examples of how quickly military technology can become obsolete, and how high the cost can be when commanders refuse to acknowledge it. What worked brilliantly in 1939 against weak opposition was nearly useless by 1943 against modern defenses, and the men who flew them paid the price. 82% casualties is not just a statistic. It is thousands of individual pilots and gunners, most of them in their early 20s, some barely out of their teens, who climbed into that cockpit knowing they probably would not come back. Some were fanatics who believed in the Nazi cause. Many were just ordinary men doing their duty, and almost all of them died. The weapon, designed to spread terror, ended up spreading just as much terror among its own crews. They knew what was coming. They knew the odds. They heard that same Jericho trumpet scream that terrified enemy troops. Except for them, it was not a weapon of psychological warfare. It was a reminder that they were flying a death trap. It is really fascinating how sick we can be as a species, and how far we can go in finding ways to destroy each other. The Stuka was designed to be a terror weapon to break enemy morale with that scream and those precision bombs. And it worked for a while. But in the end, it terrorized its own crews just as much. The transformation from unstoppable Blitzkrieg weapon to flying coffin took less than 2 years. And for the men who flew them through that transformation, there was no escape. So, what do you think about this? Was the Stuka worth the cost in lives? Could Germany have used those 6,000 aircraft and their crews more effectively? Let me know in the comments.